Boy, everyone sure is excited to talk about regenerative ranching and regenerative farming, this new concept sweeping the web. Except this new concept that we're cheering for is being implemented by the people that are supposed to have been doing this stuff from the beginning. You know, the people that are in touch with the earth, the 5th and 6th generation farmers, the people that know what they're doing because they've been doing it for so long, and yet here we are in 2020, almost 2021, and this is a new concept of not just raping the earth to its tipping point. So we already have some pretty blatant signs that this is a bunch of BS. Since regenerative ranching uses best practices, why weren't these people using best practices in the first place? There's two possible answers, and that was ignorance, that they really didn't know what they were doing the whole time, or they were just trying to extract as much from the land as possible in order to earn a buck, in order to get over that profit margin, which is increasingly harder to get over because it's incredibly unsustainable to be in animal agriculture. Another blaring warning sign about these people who are patting themselves on the back for working with Mother Nature and getting back to the way things are supposed to be is that they're leaving out nature. Hello, Rancher Bob. Would you like some antelope? Would you like some deer? Would you like some elk on your land? No, thank you. We got our own animals. We got our domesticated livestock. Fuck your native grazers, fuck your native herbivores, and especially fuck your native predators. We have the animals that we created over years of breeding and brought over from Europe. They have absolutely no place in nature. They have no role in nature, and they do not benefit nature, but we continue to breed them because that's our living. Extraction, exploitation, and then selling the flesh on the market. Working with nature. You've got to be kidding. These are the same people responsible for the eradication of our native wildlife. They're the reason that we can't bring back native predators. They want absolutely nothing to do with natural process, except, of course, in the event that their animals get to graze upon a few native plants. Speaking of native plants, how many of these people are actively going out and introducing perennial native plants? Does not work. Why? Because their fucking unnatural livestock destroy these things. When you have your studies and your little fake documentaries that herald cattle grazing as something good for the environment, and they show that when you have cattle there, good things happen, they're leaving out a really important detail. What's actually happening, if you see any positive signs, is that they reduced the amount of cattle grazing that had been taking place before. It's not that they introduced cattle and things got better. What we have here are people who exploited the land, who overgrazed, and that finally came back to bite them in the ass, and they couldn't deny it any longer. But now everyone's talking about, well, if we do regenerative grazing, you mean not overgrazing? You mean not destroying the land completely? You mean taking a few of the cattle away from there? Wow, you're such good people. You're so in touch with the earth. Looking great, cows. Keep up the fine work. The other aspect of this is that they force the cattle to move. You know, they force rotational grazing. Well, if this was natural, you wouldn't have to force it because the native herbivores do move. They don't sit there and just eat everything down to the ground and under the ground to where it doesn't come back. But once again, here we have people that we're supposed to be applauding because they're finally forcing their cows to move instead of just letting them sit there and wipe out everything. Thank you so much. You're so in touch with the earth. You got that billionaire asshole up here in California who has no business raising cattle whatsoever, but he has a hobby ranch. And this went all over the internet because, hey, look at this beautiful land where we have cattle. And look, there's actually plants and things growing too. That's because he's not doing it as a business trying to turn a buck. He unleashed a few cattle going through there. And once again, what do you think would have happened if you'd have used native herbivores? No, thank you. Not interested in helping the wildlife, not interested in giving them some habitat or seeing what would happen if we had some antelope or elk or deer, etc. No, fuck the wildlife. I'm a hobby rancher. I'm here to tell the world that cattle are the key to our future. Do you know how goddamn stupid that is? I know you're gonna go and look at all these fucking papers that have been written, funded by Animal Ag, by the way. Gee, I can't imagine if those results are skewed at all. Just use your eyes, people. Use your common sense. You're literally saying that nature had it wrong, that biodiversity was stupid and nature should have never gone down that path. Fuck bears, fuck wolves, fuck elk. All we ever really needed was cattle. Look how great the land looks. You gotta be kidding me, people. Open your eyes. That does not look like good land.
Carbon sequestration.
So a couple of people are finally debunking this bullshit, and one of them is, of course, carbon sequestration. And one of the problems with this theory is carbon equilibrium. Now, do I really have to scientifically explain that shit on top of shit on top of shit on top of shit eventually doesn't work? That maybe there should be a system involved here, that just adding more poop on top of land that's already covered and saturated with poop doesn't yield biodiversity? Yeah, you'll get something to grow, something very unnatural, and if that's what your end product is, then so be it. Stop pretending that you are in alliance with Mother Nature. And on the same note, I have a very long detailed video about this with an ecologist explaining, but here is the short version. The plants that are grown where cattle graze do not have a root system capable of carbon sequestration.
That's the extent of the roots. These are little annual grasses that live a season, a spring, and then they die.
The plants that are capable of that are perennial plants, plants with long, deep roots, ones that need to not be grazed upon by cattle in order to survive. Well, that's why we're rotating the cattle now. You honestly just had to figure that out now, after the fucking land is absolutely decimated? You're like, oh, well, if we plant some native plants, maybe this time we'll stop the cows before they completely fuck everything up. And then we'll call ourselves great because we allowed a couple of things to survive. Point Reyes National Seashore has to be the most alarming example, and it's one that is right next to me, of why this is all bullshit. The cattle grazing industry is so intensely demanding that they want every piece of grass out there to be for the cattle and the cattle alone. There is no room for nature, to the extent that they want the elk that recovered from the brink of extinction to be killed in order to protect that tiny little profit margin, supposedly, that the elk are infringing upon, because you just can't spare a blade of grass when you're trying to make a profit in animal ag. Now tell me again just how hand in hand this regenerative ranching is with Mother Nature. This is a national seashore. These are your mom and pop farms, which aren't mom and pop farms, but that's a whole documentary in itself. Let's go ahead and pretend that they're mom and pop farms, because that's what they tell everyone that they are. And everyone driving through there believes that they're mom and pop farms. And yet these mom and pop farms can't afford to let any elk out there. But we love nature, but just fuck nature. We'll say we love nature, but get nature the fuck out of here. We're trying to conduct business. You city slickers don't know what you're talking about. We've been doing this our whole lives. We do this for a living. In fact, our grandpa was doing it before us, and his grandpa before him. We know what we're doing. And yet, we're just now going to start doing it right with this new concept of regenerative ranching. Have you heard of those cutting-edge regenerative landscape companies that bring in cattle because cattle stimulate native plants so well that it just makes everything look great? Neither have I! Yes, you do need some form of animal eating plants in order for that system to be balanced, just like you need predators feeding on those animals for the system to be balanced. That's not taking place here. Once again, why aren't we using nature's animals? What's that? You're involved in an extractive, exploitive industry that depends on a bottom line that can't afford any leeway, like letting nature have a spot here? Oh, right, that's called ranching. Let me switch things up. Let me approach this topic from the other direction, if you will. Have you ever visited a farmed animal sanctuary where they take animals that have been exploited and abused on ranches and they try to give them a better life? Well, the land at those sanctuaries has been destroyed by only a handful of these animals. You want these animals to be able to roam around. You want them to enjoy some sense of freedom in the process of giving them a better life, but in so doing, you have also subjected your habitat to domestic livestock, and the results are not good. But it's not just that only a couple of cows can decimate the entire acreage of your sanctuary and turn everything that was green and beautiful to dirt and mud. It's also the mind-blowing amount of waste that these animals produce. They eat and they eat and they eat and they poop and they poop and they poop. This presents challenges to these sanctuaries on multiple levels, dealing with all of the waste that's being produced and trying to maintain their habitat in some form. And this is all being caused by only a couple of the livestock, much less hundreds of them, much less thousands of them, which is the reality of ranching that is trying to turn a profit. Meanwhile, just outside the boundary line of those sanctuaries, outside of their private property line where the land is still wild, the habitat looks good, but there are still wild animals roaming around out there. There are hooved herbivores walking around out there, and yet that land isn't destroyed. Explain that one. Cattle have no place in these habitats. Cattle did not evolve with the land. Cattle have nothing to do with local ecosystems. And if the local ecosystem should try to interact with a cow, let's say a wolf or a coyote or something tries to eat a commodity animal, a livestock animal, well, we all know what happens to those animals. But yeah, we're back to nature. I feel compelled to add an asterisk to that particular section of footage because, as you can see yourselves, nothing's particularly compelling in terms of being lush and green. Well, it was filmed in yet another horrible, horrible drought in California and during a heat wave. You can see that some of the perennial plants, such as trees and shrubs, have managed to maintain a lot of their green. But other plants, even the native ones that are perennial, eventually give way to a drought. And so nothing's looking particularly great right now. But this brings us to another aspect of this whole argument, in that much of the drought-resistant native perennial plants have been choked out and replaced by annual plants that turn into dry fire fuel every year, and those were introduced by animal agriculture. And through their invasive nature, they spread. They are spread intentionally by the people who plant them. They are spread by birds. They are spread in the hooves and the fecal matter of animals that eat them and then walk into new areas. And therefore, you are seeing more and more areas that might have managed to maintain their greenness even in a drought time are instead replaced with dry fire fuel. Yet another problem with this idea of regenerative ranching, using the very animals who are the reason that native perennials were replaced with non-drought resistant plants in the first place.
So what's the bottom line? What's the end result? What do these sanctuaries end up having to do? Well, it's the same thing that ranches have to do. They take the waste, they take the compost, and they spread it over the land that has already been destroyed by the same animals that produce the waste in order to make something grow back for them to eat the next year. That's not natural. That's not nature. That is a way of overcoming a problem that only exists because of those animals in the first place. I'm not ripping on animal sanctuaries. Power to anyone who wants to provide some form of mercy or compassion to these animals. The point is that the very existence, the very persistence in continuing to breed and create animals that exist solely for the purpose of being killed by humans to eat something that they don't need to eat and that is incredibly unsustainable ends with a problem. It starts as a problem and ends as another problem.
Since we're talking about animal sanctuaries and being kind to animals and saving them, I want to address one of the most ridiculous arguments I've heard against not eating meat, and that's that if you don't eat them, then they will all be killed. Just repeat that. If we don't eat them, they will be killed. Now, is this argument coming from the people who raise these animals with the sole intent of killing them to sell their flesh? And who, by the way, do this as soon as the animals are big enough to sell on the market so they can be replaced as quickly as possible with the next round of animals that are being raised just to be killed to sell their flesh? Or is this coming from the people who purchase the flesh of these murdered animals and thus support the endless cycle of continuing to raise animals that exist only to die? The only way to end the death of these cows, if you're going to pretend that you have some sort of concern for their well-being, is to end the process entirely. It's amusing in a sick and twisted way to hear people defend consuming dairy products because they don't want the cows to die, when the baby males that are pulled from their mothers are literally thrown into trash cans or sent straight to slaughter because they don't want those animals drinking their mother's milk. But yeah, thanks for your concern for the animals. Or just the eating meat argument in general, that I have to eat the flesh of this dead animal on my plate, otherwise his friends standing in line at the slaughterhouse will be killed. Because if you don't eat that meat, then all those animals in line to be slaughtered are going to be saved. So back to saving the animals. There are 94 million cows or something of that number in the United States alone right now. If we saved all of them and were to give them space on a sanctuary, that would mean we would have to buy a lot more wild open land and convert that to sanctuary. And as you have seen, that would essentially mean destroying that land. That essentially means taking that land from wild animals and getting rid of wild native habitat. So once again, that doesn't work. You have to stop this endless cycle of producing animals that have no place in a natural ecosystem in the first place. These animals exist for an industry that makes money indulging the selfish appetites of human beings. Now, this Alan Savory asshole who was kind enough to fuck up Africa before deciding the rest of us need to fuck up where we live also, is again talking about places where we humans wiped out the native animals and then left a gaping hole in a system. And he's saying, look what I discovered by introducing animals, conveniently the ones that I own and profit off of, some good things can happen. No shit, there's a massive gaping hole and you introduced some form of what was missing. But he also talks about grazing on grasslands as though we all have access to native grasslands. Our native grasslands were wiped out by animal agriculture. You aren't talking about native grasses. You are talking about the bullshit that is planted by ranchers annually in a desperate effort to grow something for the cattle to feed because they destroyed the native grasses. Alan Savory is basically the Donald Trump of animal agriculture, just proclaiming what he wants to be truth as fact with arrogant confidence while backpedaling on things he said whenever it's contradicted by science.
Oh, this is backed by very, very solid science, the best science. Oh, it's the worst science. It's just garbage science.
I read a recent pro-ranching article talking about how these massive elk were causing damage. Massive, stating that they were 500 pounds. Yeah, that's not a small animal. Guess what? Double that and you have a small heifer cow. And people respond to that by saying, well then, how come it worked when we had bison? We didn't have bison in California, you fucking idiots. And then you also have the people say, well look, it worked in Europe. This isn't Europe. How fucking dumb do you have to be to understand that different habitats are, how shall I put it, different? You can't just take massive grazing animals from an industry in Europe and dump them on an arid sensitive habitat and expect the same results. Oh, sorry, there I go, talking about science and nature again, when you ranchers are the holistic geniuses. My bad. You guys already knew all of this, I'm sure. When people like that say that their ancestors came to California and saw a land that was ideal for dairy, what they're saying is, this place is prime for the raping. Look, people, you're desperately trying to believe this shit that doesn't make any sense because it's what you want to believe, because it's what you're already familiar with and that you like. You don't want to give it up, but it doesn't make any sense at all. You will find plenty of papers that make claims, but you personally will never own 2 plots of land on which you take a native setting and introduce cattle to it and end up with it better. You will never have a situation in which taking cattle away from that land that you then destroyed does not result in it getting better. You will never have 2 plots side by side where you use native animals instead of cattle, where the cattle would have done a better job. Never.